Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. So let's start today introducing a first example of a model. I would say a prototypical example of a model to be used as a decision support system. On the lecture on Monday, we have introduced decision theory. So I gave you a basics for building a decision support system, so a theoretical base for building a decision support system. Today, we will look at the prototypical model describing for decision support system. What is the multi-criteria analysis model? Is a decision model that is based, as the name says, on two multi-criteria methods. The idea is that of passing from a single goal to multiple goals. Generally, classical methods of analysis to solve managerial decision problems are based on linear single criterion optimization. We have seen that in environmental impact assessment, the single criterion optimization is not always applicable. We have seen an example on Monday that of going from city A to city B, and so going by train, car, or buses. And we said in that simple example that we should, or we may have been optimizing three criteria. Let's give a look at three criteria: going with bus, going by train, or going by car. And we said that by applying these three criteria, the solution was that of selecting the train. We had a problem of justifying the choice, and we have seen that multi-criteria methods is one of the simple of the first examples of decision support systems models that may help the decision of policymaker in justifying its choice. Let's see another example. Let's say we have to evaluate two different processes for electricity production, having, for example, a limit of emissions of pollutants and the availability of fuel. So, for example, in this case, we may introduce two criteria: a function to maximize, so maximize the function of x, where x is the energetic efficiency. So the first criteria is that of maximizing the efficiency. And then a second criteria may come from constraints linked to the availability of fuel. For example, we may introduce two constraints for the QC smaller than DC, where QC is the quantity of coal used and DC is its availability. QM smaller than DM, where QM is the quantity of methane used and DM it is availability. Emissions should be lower than table values required by law. For example, in Italy, 152, 2006. So you see here we have several criteria: function to maximize, that is, for example, the energetic efficiency, or some constraints that are linked to the availability of fuel or to limits to the emissions. So in general, we may say that in a complex evaluation problem, linear optimization may be too rigid function. It is not always possible to identify a single objective, as the example that we had just given, or the objective is not quantifiable, like, for example, in the case of travel from city A to city B, one of the criteria was comfort, and comfort is difficult to explicitate numerically. Constraints are not always explicit. In general, the reality, as you know, is not perfect or may not be perfectly modeled, so we shall use approximations. The possible solution is that of using nonlinear programming models that is complex and always based on a perfect quantification of objectives, or we may employ the optimization models with several objectives. This is the case of multi-criteria models, that are models in which we try to optimize the outcomes of our evaluation by comparing the results through several criteria. The idea on the basis of multi-criteria is that if something is considered to be valid at all, then it definitely is for several reasons. So the idea is find a set of reasons or criteria that should help us in justifying our choice. Multi-criteria models are based on the idea that in a complex decision problem, for example, it is the case in environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental pricing, there may be many aspects not all traceable to a single goal. What are the advantages of employing multi-criteria models? This approach allows to take into account different priorities and preferences. So this goes in the direction of participation. You may recall that on Monday we have introduced the requirements for a rational decision, that are participation, rationality, transparency, and reproducibility. So takes into account different priorities and preferences. So this allows participation, highlights the different components of the problems and their relationships, organizing and synthesizing this data in an organic way. This goes toward the direction of the rationality of the methodology, makes explicit all the data processed. So this goes in the direction of transparency, reduces the arbitrariness of the decisions, and this goes into the direction of reproducibility. What are the disadvantages of employing these methodologies? Might exaggerate any juxtapositions, meaning that some of the criteria may have an exaggerated role in the process of decision making, but we will see how to manage these problems by introducing weights. Lends itself to manipulation. This is typical to models. Of course, it is a simplification of a reality, like it is always with models. Some techniques may be very complex. Today, we will introduce some of the least complex ones. Sometimes the process is even too transparent. And this is this sentence goes with a big question mark, because sometimes too much of transparency may be a drawback for the decision processes, because too much of transparency may suggest the subjects that are involved in the decision process, in particular the public, might suggest some important observation that may may slow the decision process. Why are so important in environmental impact assessment? Because they allow to synthesize a lot of information. They take into account several objectives, that is typically the case in environmental impact assessment, uses arrays of assessment, that is a useful way to organize and communicate information, as we have seen when we were discussing indicators.
Professor, I have a question out of curiosity. If there is not enough data on different scenarios or for different products, based on for which we are conducting these analysis, let's say food or something else, agriculture, if there's not enough data, then are these analyses or the criterias good enough for the results, for producing the results?
Of course, we are not in a perfect world, so we will always find us in a conditions in which there is not enough data. The idea of introducing these models, these methodologies, is exactly that of trying to reduce the arbitrariness of a decision, and also to cope with the fact that our knowledge of the reality is not always complete. So that the idea of these approaches is that of helping the decision maker to select those aspects that are really relevant and for which we have at least some data. This has to do with the selection of criteria. As we will see, it is one of the first steps of a multi-criteria analysis model building. And the criteria are selected as exactly on the basis of the objective of the decision process, but also on the availability of data. Does this answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, we said they are important because allow to synthesize a large amount of information, take into account several objectives, and I will say also different points of view. Uses arrays of assessment, that is a useful way to organize and communicate information. The decision may be closer to reality compared, for example, to the cost-benefit analysis that will be the subject of a lecture of next week. And you will see the cost-benefit analysis being one of the first models, decision super models, but cost-benefit analysis, as we were saying, it is not always enough sophisticated methodology in order to ensure the transparency, the rationality, the reproducibility of methodologies and so on, and of the decision and so on. How do these multi-criteria analysis model work? The object of analysis is generally broken down into simple factors. We may call these factors the criteria, which describe it exhaustively or hopefully exhaustively. These criteria are then analyzed all separately, and then several alternatives are then evaluated with respect to each single criterion of choice. You may recall that this approach has similarities with the approach of Leopold matrix or classification of environmental impacts as a crossing between project activities and environmental components. Here we are applying the same approach, compositional approach, in more general terms, and we are building a tool that is a mathematical tool that is being derived from the theory of decision. And so that this makes our model most solid, robust, and maybe may help the decision maker to justify his choice. So the object of analysis is broken down to simple factors. So the criteria describes the important aspect of the object of analysis. Then the criteria are analyzed separately, and then several alternatives are evaluated against these criteria. So the fundamental starting point from a multi-criteria analysis is that of selecting several criteria and having the possible of choosing different alternatives for the realization of a project or a human work. So you see, this is a way of formalizing what we have seen up to now, up to today. We have seen several times, we have said several times But the environmental impact assessment procedure is a procedure that allows us to select different alternatives on the basis of our understanding of the system. This is exactly a formalization of this procedure. So we have, we start from the scope of analysis. From the scope of analysis, we define a set of criteria, criterion C1, criterion C2, criterion C3, and then we compare the different alternatives, option A, option B, and option C, against these criteria. Analyze option A with respect to criterion C1 or to criterion C2 or criterion C3. Analyze option B against this criterion, each criterion, and so on. So we may say that the criteria are the means by which the various alternatives are compared to each other over the objective of the decision maker. We may introduce this definition and saying that a criterion is a real function, f, such that it is meaningful to compare two alternatives, let's say A and B, of a set of alternatives capital A, with respect to a particular point of view solely on the basis of the values of the function fa and fb. Okay, this is a strict definition that is inherited from the theory of decisions. There is nothing particular in this. In practice, what we may say is that the criteria represent the environmental components or the cost or the social aspects and so on. So what we are doing here, we are generalizing the Leopold matrix approach, in which instead of only considering environmental components and project activities, we may also consider cost, social aspects, and so on. This is necessary because, especially in environmental impact assessment, cost, social aspects, cultural heritage, or single subject preferences are all aspects that may have a significant role in the process of decision making. By convention, criteria and attributes are synonyms. So we may call a multi-criteria or multi-attributes analysis. This comes from a theory of operational research, but is a subsubject of a decision theory. Multi-criteria analysis in general refers to a problem of choice among a finite number of alternatives, while multi-objective analysis instead refers to decision problems inherent with infinite alternatives. In practice, they are also synonym. Multi-criteria or multi-objectives may be considered synonyms, like criteria and attributes may be considered synonyms. Let's look to the procedure in detail for building a multi-criteria analysis. There are 5 main phases. When I ask to a student, can you describe me a multi-criteria analysis model? Then the good students answer, the multi-criteria analysis model is built on a procedure that is based on 5 main phases. The first phase is definition of evaluation matrix. Evaluation matrix is a matrix by which you evaluate the different alternatives against the possible criteria. Then you proceed to second step, that is standardization of data, because you want to be able to make some kind of numerical elaboration on your data, so the criteria should be standardized, and we will see soon what we mean by that. Third step, assignment of weights. So not all the criteria are equally weight or equally important. Instead, it is up to decision maker or to the consultant or to the expert, in general you, environmental engineers, to assign different weights to the different criteria. This is implicitly a way of saying that some of the criteria are more important. Saying that some of the criteria are more important means essentially that the multi-criteria model is oriented to some specific objectives. In particular, the consultant may give a higher weight, for example, to economical and environmental criteria and a lower weight to technological criteria. This makes that your multi-criteria model is more oriented to environmental and economical aspects and less oriented to technical aspects. So the assignment of weights, that is a very subjective activity that is carried on the basis of his expert knowledge by the consultant. It is a way of tuning the decision method or the decision model or a multi-criteria model on the particular necessity of a decision or on the particular aspects that are thought to be more relevant. The fourth step after assigning weights is that of calculating the sorting or rankings. Ranking of what? Ranking of alternative. By employing this multi-criteria analysis, you will end up with a ranking, a justified ranking of alternatives. So you will evaluate different alternatives against the different criteria, and the result of this evaluation is a ranking of alternatives in terms of a more important or less important according to your model. Again, this is highly subjective. The results of the ranking, of course, depends on the weight you assign to the different criteria, not only, but also on the way you're building the criteria, as we will see soon. So, with fine-tuning of a methodology, fine-tuning in terms of definition of different weights for different criteria, allows the decision maker to calibrate or to tune the model on the specific objectives or on the specific requirements of a procedure. Of course, what is a specific requirement? This depends on the type of problems, environmental problems, on the type of environmental situation, or on the type of pressures, on the type of activities, on the situation, or even on the tastes of the consultant. The last step in the building of a multi-criteria model is that of conducting sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis tries to evaluate which are the most relevant aspects of a procedure in terms of changing the results, so changing the sorting of the alternatives. So you will do sensitivity analysis on weight or on the formalization of the criteria, on the standardization, or the choice of the criteria, and so on. How do we build an evaluation matrix? Impact matrix, analysis matrix, evaluation matrix, score matrix, appraisal tables are all synonyms. You remember the impact matrix, the Leopold matrix, is a particular case of an evaluation matrix, Leopold matrix, in which you evaluate the project activities against the criteria that are environmental components. An evaluation matrix is an n by m two-dimensional array which crosses n objectives or criteria with the m option of choices or alternatives, presenting n times m indicators with different units of measurements, but may be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed. For example, one criteria may be land expressed in hectares, or another criteria may be the cost expressed in millions of euros. A third criteria may be that of impacts on the landscape, and so on. So you see, in the evaluation matrix, we may include all different types of criteria. I gave you an example, a very heterogeneous example, for example, hectares, costs, or impact on the landscape. I give you here an example of formalization of the criteria. For example, for criteria A, that is maybe the first one, the land expressed in hectares. So you may express 0.4 hectares, 0.8 hectares, 0.6 hectares for the alternative 1, alternative 2, alternative 3. Criterion B, we said it is a cost, for example, 60 millions of euros. But criterion C, it is one of those indicators, but not always necessarily expressed by numbers. In this case, typically impact on the landscape, you may see big, small, or intermediate values of impacts. So you may employ plus, plus, minus, plus, or smileys, or whatever to differentiate the difference. Alternatives against the third criterion. The evaluation matrix not only serves to identify the impacts, but also to organize the data possibly in a very complex way. Evaluation matrices consist of two-dimensional checklists, a list of activities, project, plan, or program, is related with a list of components that may be environmental, social, economic, or technological, or whatever. So this is a two-dimensional representation of a cause-effect relationships between planning, programming activities and the social and environmental factors potentially subject to change. For each intersection between the elements of the two lists, it's possible to verify the actual presence of the impact of the reporting matrix and possibly already give an assessment on evaluation matrix, impact matrix, and so on. So you see, here we are generalizing the concept of Leopold matrix or the concept of the impact matrix by introducing evaluation matrices. There are several methods for the construction of evaluation matrices. Methods that are generally based on a hierarchical system. We go from generic elements, environmental components, for example, phases of a plan and so on. And we descend to the details. So we make a breakdown forward. Sometimes it is also possible to use the reverse process and backward, going from the very specific to a very general. It is often based on scientific literature and case studies. Typically, a matrix of impact may be disaggregated by, for example, temporal horizons, so the stages of a project. So you may have different matrices referring to different temporal horizons, or may be disaggregated according to geographical areas. So, for example, in different localization of a project, you will have different evaluation matrix, or typologies of a project, or actors involved in the evaluation process. So once you have built the evaluation matrix, you switch, you go to the second step, that is that of standardization. Why do we need to do standardization? Because we need to make data in the array homogeneous and operational. Operational, what does this mean? But we want to make calculation on this data. So the data are transformed into dimensionless values, by convention these are dimensionless, with one or more logical mathematical functions. In general, for standardization, there are two main types of procedure. We have linear standardizations and value function or utility function standardization. The linear standardization employs simple mathematical functions that operate on values in each column of the matrix, can vary, of course, from column to column. So for each criteria, you may have different way of standardizing the values. The classical standardization functions or methodologies are those listed here. For example, you may standardize by row maximum. This means that in each cell of a column, you divide by the maximum value in the column, or you may employ an ideal value function. This means that you employ a function in which you normalize the distance of the value of a criteria from the minimum idealized value and from the maximum idealized value of a criteria. So here, essentially, in ideal value, what you're doing is that you are identifying an interval that is the minimum possible value of the criteria and the maximum possible value of the criteria, and you standardize the indicator, criteria indicator, by this range. You can standardize by normalizing by the mean, or you can standardize by interval standardization. This is simply this is one of the most common standardization. This gives you a value of 0 when the criteria is the minimum, and the value of 1 when you are on the criteria of maximum. So if you apply interval standardization, you are essentially converting the criteria indicator into the 0-1 interval. 0 is the minimum and 1 is the maximum. Or then you may employ an additive constraint, so you may divide by the sum, all the sum of the row, or you employ a vector normalization. So you may, for example, divide by the norm of a vector representing the criteria. The value utility function is a little bit more sophisticated, and it is not only a mathematical function. Instead, it requires some understanding or some knowledge of the process, and you assign to each indicator value a corresponding score of merit, preference, utility. It is generally dimensionless in the interval between 0 and 1. It is necessary to define a function for each indicator, so you will have for each column a different value or utility function. Typical example is the dose response function that you employ in ecotoxicology evaluation in order to evaluate if an exposition to a certain toxicant event is lethal or not, using the dose response function. It is said value when the data are deterministic, and it is said utility when the data are stochastic. The utility measures the satisfaction of the decision maker. I'm giving here an example of value utility function. For example, you may employ a linear one-to-one value utility function in which you convert to a 0 when your indicator is at a minimum, and you convert to a 1 when your indicator is at the maximum. Or you may have non-linear value utility function in which you may have a 0 at the minimum, and you may have a kind of asymptotic tendency at the maximum, with a tendency to grow. Or you may have more sophisticated value utility function. This is the third example. You may, for example, consider phosphorus concentration, average annual concentration of phosphorus. When we all know that the concentration of phosphorus is below some threshold value, when the ecosystem is not in a healthy condition, because there is not enough phosphorus for living systems to survive. But we may also know that phosphorus may be, in terms of nutrients, a pollutant. So you may, when the concentration of phosphorus grows, you may have kind of eutrophication conditions. So, but the quality of the systems tend to zero when the concentration value of a toxicant overcomes a fixed value threshold. The value utility function definition, certain functions are derived in an objective way by laboratory tests. This is the case of a dose response. Others utility functions are necessarily subjective. So, for example, aesthetic values, I like, I don't like, it is nice, it is not nice, or relative to social tolerance, this is accepted, non-accepted, and so on, and therefore are subject to change depending on the evaluator. So these are highly subjective criteria. Also subject to some ambiguity, these latter are widely used in evaluation of sustainability. So value utility functions are by large one of the most employed way for standardizing the criteria into your evaluation matrix. The main difference between the two types of normalization is that in the first case, that is the case of standardization, classical standardization, linear standardization, the function may need not to vary from column to column of a matrix. In the second case, you define a function for each indicator. So the function, the value function that you employ typically depends on the meaning of the indicator. Okay, now we have an evaluation matrix. We have standardized the matrix, so we have converted the criteria to numbers. Now we are ready for going to the third step, that part of the assignment of weights. What are weights? Weights are dimensionless numerical values that measure the priorities of the various aspects of the problem. So you are differentiating the importance of the criteria with the weights. They never have absolute, but only relative value. In statistical terms, they are the marginal rate of substitution between the various criteria. Okay, this is statistics. For example, we may have two criteria. For criteria 1, the value is 30. For criteria 2, the value is 10. But if we say that criteria 1 is 3 times more relevant than criteria 2, then the weight 3 obliges you, forces you to give more relevance to criteria 1 respect to criteria 2. How much more? Exactly 3 times more relevance. The assignment of weights is another delicate aspect, besides that of standardization. There are 3 main classes of techniques for assignment of weights: direct assignments, comparisons in pairs, method based only on a ranking, even if incomplete, ranking of alternatives, even if incomplete. The direct assignment is the easiest and by large the most applied method, but of course it is the more ambiguous. The weights are assigned directly based on a predetermined scale of scoring, for example, 1 to 100 or 1 to 1000 and so on, or distributing this score among all the criteria. The sum may be asked to be equal to 100 or 1000. Direct assignment is by large the most employed, but the most ambiguous way of assigning weights. By direct assignment, it is the consultant, the expert, that decides that in your decision model, for one criteria is more relevant than another one. Then the comparison in pairs is a little bit more sophisticated. The criteria are then compared in pairs, and the relative score is assigned. This builds a matrix of pair comparisons. It is, of course, a square matrix. is symmetrical about the main diagonal, the values of each row of the array are then aggregated into a final vector. For example, here we are comparing three criteria, criteria A, criteria B, criteria C. We are weighting these criteria one against each other. Of course, criteria A is equivalent to criteria B, A. Criteria A is 1/2 of criteria B. Criteria A is 7 times criteria C. Of course, this matrix, it is a diagonal matrix, has some strict criteria of definition. For example, with an inverse matrix, if you have that criteria B weights twice criteria A, then of course criteria, if you have that criteria B weights twice when criteria A, then of course criteria A weights 1/2 when criteria B. You may, once you have evaluating pairs, you may build a vector or a final vector of weights. In this case, for example, we have the eigenvector. How do you say eigenvector? Eigenvalue. The eigenvalue of the matrix as gli autovalori, no? Eigenvalue of a matrix as weights. By convention, the assignment of weights are made by array elements that are positives. The diagonal elements are, of course, the inverse of one another. So A ij is equal to 1/AJI. The diagonal values are, of course, equal to unity. Consequently, the number of comparison required if n is the number of criteria is n times n minus 1 divided by 2. So you need to compare essentially 1/2 of the matrix of comparison of the criteria in order to build or to obtain the weights of the different criteria. Then we may look to methods based, for example, only on ranking, even if incomplete. This is a less common and very complex way of seeing weights. There is no quantitative assessment, only order of importance. So what I do is I make a ranking of a different criteria. This is more important than this one, but it is on its turn more important than the other one, and so on. It is assumed that the sum of weight is always equal to 1. We have 3 main approaches for building this kind of distribution of weights. The expected value, extremal values, and random weights. We will go very quickly because I'm not going to ask you very much about this. Expected values, given the premise, it assumes a distribution of values that are equally likely. The average value are those that approximate satisfactorily the vector of weights sought. So in this case, we are not using eigenvectors or eigenvalues. Instead, we are using values derived by expected values. The weights do not depend on the nature of the criteria or the preferences of the decision maker, but only by their number and order. Extremal values, these are methodologies that employ only extreme weights that has to be considered. And by extreme weight, meaning the maximal or minimal values, all weights are related. And related ranking included between these extremes comply with the order of priorities imposed. And then the last one is that of random weights. It is generated a large number of random rankings, and all the possible combination of weights satisfying initial assumptions are calculated. For each of these sets of weights, it is calculated the resulting ranking of alternatives and the probability for each ordering. The ordering is derived from a comparison of probabilities. Okay. Once we have assigned the weights, we are ready to set or to start employing our decision model by starting to calculate rankings. Rankings of what? Of different alternatives. The basic mechanism is that of combining weights and standardized indicators for any alternative. Compare alternatives to each other based on the values obtained. Again, here two main techniques, the weighted sum and the indices of concordance and discordance. The weighted sum is by largely the most applied, while the index of concordance, indices of concordance and discordance is a little bit more sophisticated. The weighted sum, it is a prescriptive technique based on transitivity or completeness, and it is extremely common and simple. Even sometimes it is too simple and can be unfaithful in the case of very complex situation. Each indicator is multiplied by the respective weight and summed with those of the same line. I will shortly briefly give you an example of this. The indices of concordance and discordance, it is instead of prescriptive, it is a descriptive technique depending on the assumption of incomparability and intransitivity. A comparison is made in pairs of all the alternatives by evaluating two different indices, the index of concordance and the index of discordance. Let's see an example of these indices of concordance and discordances. The concordance index measures the satisfaction of choosing one alternative in respect to another one. For the index of concordance referred to alternative 1 gives me the satisfaction of choosing alternative 1 compared to alternative 2 with respect to the criteria C1, C2, and so on, is equal to the sum of the corresponding weights. So we build the index of concordance by building a matrix in which you sum the weights of those indicators for which your choice wins. So you are really here converting weights into indicators of choice. The discordance index instead measures the regret in dismissing alternative 2 compared to alternative 1 and is easily measured as the maximum difference between the values of the indicator of those criteria for which is expressed the regret of choosing the second option than the first one, usually but not necessarily normalized to the maximum difference of columns. It sounds more complicated than it is. Let's see how to build this methodology. Let's construct the two matrices by pairwise comparisons, that of discordance and that of concordance, and aggregate these values respectively into two vectors whose elements are the indices of concordance IC and the indices of discordance ID, obtained according to the following formulas. So for the index of concordance, you are making the difference on the diagonal in the matrix of concordance, while for the index of discordance, you're making the index, the difference, the diagonal for the matrix of discordance. Now you obtain a ranking of the alternatives with the index of concordance and discordance. So the alternatives are then sorted into two lists, increasing index of concordance and decreasing index of discordance. Let's see an example, so maybe it may be made clearer. We have three alternatives, A1, A2, A3, and we compare these three alternatives through three criterion, C1, C2, C3. Those weights are then respectively 02, 02, 03, and 05. So we are weight much more the third criteria than the first two. The impact matrix or the evaluation matrix is this first one. Evaluation matrix compares with the three different criteria with three different alternatives. Then we may build a concordance matrix by choosing those values of the criteria for which those values of a criteria indicator for which it is expressed a satisfaction of choosing. For example, let's compare alternative A1 and alternative A2. According to criteria C1, alternative A1 wins. According to criteria C2, alternative A2 wins. According to criteria C3, alternative A2 wins. So, in the concordant matrix, you will use the sum of those indicators for which the sum of the weights of those indicators for which alternative wins. In the case of criteria 1, we said alternative 1 wins against alternative 2. Alternative 1 has the criteria 1, sorry, has the weight 0.2. In the case of criteria 2, alternative 1 loses. So you only include the weight of the criteria for which the alternative wins. So in this case, you put 0.2, that is exactly the weight of criteria 1. Let's compare alternative 1 and alternative 3. Alternative 1 wins against alternative 3 for criteria 1, wins against alternative 3 for criteria 2, and loses against alternative 3 for criteria 3. So here you have to sum the weights of criteria 1 and criteria 2, that is 0.2 and 0.3. So the weights that you put here is 0.5. We may do the same evaluation for the other alternatives. So the concordance matrix is a matrix in which you express the comparisons. So it is a 3 by 3, where 3 or n by n matrix, where n is the number of alternatives, in which we are comparing the alternatives in terms of concordance. How much I am happy of choosing one alternative against another one. For the discordant matrix, it is a little bit more sophisticated. The point is that in discordant matrix, you should put into the matrix the maximum difference between the value in the indicator column. So in the column, the criteria column described by the indicator. So in this case, for example, if I choose alternative A1 against alternative A3, according to the criteria 1, A1 wins, so A3 loses. So if I choose A1 instead of A3, sorry, if I choose A3 instead of A1, I'm losing. According to criteria 3, if I'm choosing A3 instead of A1, I am losing again. So I shall put the maximum value of the difference between those, let's see, maximum difference between the values of the indicator of those criteria for which is expressed the regret of choosing. Let's see another example. more numerical example. I have to add that normally for the discordance matrix, it is normalized the difference of the values of the indicator with the maximum difference of the criteria indicator for both criteria that lose, and then it is chosen the maximum values. In practice, with the same example, this is the evaluation matrix. From this evaluation matrix, we compute concordance matrix according to the rules we express. Then we calculate a discordance matrix. When we made a summation along the rows, so that we obtain the index of concordance, that is 0.7, 1.6, and 0.7, and the index of discordance 1.8, 1.5, and 1.7. So that when you compare the three alternatives, you have two different rankings. One ranking is a concordance ranking, so for which you have three concordance values: 0.6 for alternative 1, 1.2 for alternative 2, and 0.6 for alternative 3. And then you have a discordance vector, for which you have 0.1 for alternative 1, 0.5, minus 0.5 for alternative 2, and 0.4 for alternative 3. For one example, you may notice that in order of concordance, there is no difference between alternative 1 and alternative 3, while in order of discordance, there is a difference between alternative 1 and alternative 3. So the method of concordance and discordance indices is much sophisticated methodology for building up a ranking of the different alternatives. Okay, these are all examples. I recall you that the last step of the building of a multi-criteria analysis is that of carrying a sensitivity analysis. This particularly indicated in cases of uncertainty and in order to ensure a proper evaluation of possible points of view of the problem. It is operating on the results to see what changes in the model of analysis can generate substantial differences in performance of alternatives. And you look for point of inversion, so are points for what values of criteria and indicator there is a reversal of the order of alternatives. So in practice, you make a sensitivity analysis by changing, for example, the values of weight. The values of the weight, or the values of a criteria indicators, or the values of a single criteria, and you study how are changing the ranking. Typically, the purpose is that of identifying the most sensitive components of the model, maybe parameters, weights, or criteria, but make rankings vary significantly. We employ as classically the condition number, so it is a number that tells us how much it is proportional, varied the values of the indicator as a consequence of the values of the parameters. There are three main types of sensitivity analysis on the methodology, so to apply a different method of data standardization, for example, and when possible, of a computation of final scores. So you may standardize the data in different ways and evaluate how these different standardization are important in the production of different ranking of alternatives. You may make a sensitive analysis on the criteria and other delete some decision criteria. It is used to check if basic criteria are missing, for example, or on the weight that is the most sensitive, the most used. You change the ratings on certain criteria. This allows you to notice the degrees of influence of each factor on the final decision. I recall you that the weights of the criteria are the tuning parameters that allow you to change the behavior of the multi-criteria model. It is classical. The sensitivity measure S6 measure the sensitivity of alternative X to criteria B. It is normally investigated at least 2 levels of the variation. It is useful to determine more accurately the values of more sensitive criteria, and further levels of variation for more sensitive criteria may be seen or may be foreseen. Okay, I think that we can stop here for today with the sensitivity analysis. Here you have some products, software products that will help you in building multi-criteria models. Definite is one of the most diffuse one. Typically in GIS analysis, you employ multi-criteria approaches for sustaining decisions. Okay, I stop here now. If you have any questions, I wait for your questions. Otherwise, we will see next week. And I anticipate you that next week we will discuss and choose the topics for the work group analysis that you are supposed to do. So starting from next week, you are supposed to divide yourself in groups, and you are supposed to choose a topic for your work group application. Okay, do you have any questions?
Professor?
Yes.
So if I remember well, in the group we should be between 4 and 5.
Yes, it is very open. You can choose.
Okay.
Between 4 and 5, I think that 4 is a perfect number. 5 is slightly too much. 6 is really too much. But anyway, I'm open to accept any grouping.
Okay. Thank you.